Hey guys, this, similar to the Solak guide, has been a long time coming because I've been postponing this project, just not having any idea how to tackle it properly. It's a very confusing and unrestricted design. That will be the range style, and it's difficult to predict accurately what exactly is going to happen because you have dynamic adrenaline with range, and that is separate from the other two styles, with the exception of maybe relentless procs. What is this guy doing? It's supremely annoying. I'm going to be covering some basic range rotations, why they look the way they do, and then I'm going to increase the difficulty of those rotations and adding more and more things together and explaining different scenarios where this could be useful. I'm not going to do continuous 5-minute gems for most of this. I'll probably do like 1 or 2. I'm rather going to focus on smaller blocks of different stuff you can do with range that is applicable to different situations, and then the patchwork of figuring out a boss rotation is going to be more up to you. I won't be going through specific boss rotations for any specific bosses with this, because that would take me a fucking day and a half to record all that footage and just talk through 30 minutes of explanation to 10 different bosses, and I really don't think anyone cares. I might do that for something like Solak, and maybe for the Elite Dungeon stuff that I do a lot and where I also range a lot because it's extremely beneficial. I could probably go through Raksha at some point, but this will be more general knowledge about how to range and the stuff that I do, why I do it. Fair disclaimer is that the skill seeding of range is incredibly high. You'll see people do really, really advanced stuff. They'll be switching between different pocket slots for different effects, depending on how these effects apply to different abilities. They'll be juggling more than 2 types of bolts. They'll be using other weapon combinations, the more expensive variants with Blightbound offense, with different dice on them. This is going to look different from player to player almost, unless you get to like the extremely high end, talking the way that people do this on world records, and the only thing that really separates the approach on a world record rotation is the dynamic nature of range adren, which I'll be going through and explaining when I get to using my Hydrix effect bolts. But for now, we're going to start with going through the different gear and the different perks, the upgrade path to some extent, though I don't want to make specific recommendations because it's sort of up to everyone. Also depends on how much money you want to blow and all that, but I will be explaining as much as I can about the gear and the perk situation and the ammunitions and the different necklaces in the following clip. So here we see an overview of most of the relevant gear for ranging, and I'm going to talk you through this because I realize this is a lot of information, a lot of icons, and not a lot of this makes a ton of sense to people without having had it explained to them. So first up, what I've done is I've listed the perk combinations for two-handed and main and offhand, or dual wields. Some of these rely on this ability, that's why this is on a separate line. But let's go through the two-handed variants first, because that is the easiest to explain. Now there's 2 variants of what you would put on your two-handed weapon, which would be an Eldritch Crossbow at the endgame. The first one is Precise 6, Ruthless 1, with Aftershock 4 and Equilibrium 2. The reason for this is because the Aftershock 4, the Equilibrium 2, and the Precise 6 become your damage base for every ability. This is going to apply to everything. The Ruthless addition is just the most useful thing that you could put in combination with Precise 6 that applies to almost everything. Ruthless is kind of niche. It's not going to help you everywhere. It does help you a little bit in some places over shorter time windows. If you don't get this combination, then seriously, don't sweat about it. It's not a very difficult combination to get, but this is the ideal variant of it. If you have greater ricochet, this changes because the Ruthless Edition becomes swapped around, so you combine Precise 6 with Aftershock 1, and then instead of Aftershock 4 and Equilibrium 2, you have Caraming 4 and Equilibrium 2. The reason for that is because in this case, you will be camping your Eldritch Crossbow as your main weapon. don't necessarily have to camp the Eldritch Crossbow just because you have greater ricochet, but if you use the Eldritch Crossbow as a main weapon, I would say. Then the Aftershock gets killed in favor of Caraming, because Caraming makes greater ricochet just disgustingly powerful, and overall you just see an increase for several reasons, most of which I will be covering throughout this. I understand that it might be frustrating to hear that I'm going to talk about something later or whatever. There will be a lot of that in this video because range is pretty dynamic and it's very difficult to boil down everything to simple rules, because even though guidelines and some basic rules exist, a lot of it is situational and has to do with what you're doing and how you do it rather than one way ruling all. This is very different from the melee guide in that sense. For your main hands, I've listed the main hand combination 3 times here. This does not mean that you need to have 3 main hands. The only reason I put it up there is because I want you to see that it combines with the different offhands. So your main hand would be Precise 6 and Aftershock 1. The reason for the Aftershock 1 rather than the Ruthless 1 is that you want to be able to keep your Aftershock stacks while you're switching the offhands, which the main offhand is the one that's carrying the Aftershock 4. So you'll be using the main offhand the most. Then you'll have a offhand flank switch with flanking 4 in whichever equilibrium tier you can add to that flanking. It could be just a straight flanking 4. It could be EQ1 or EQ2. EQ2 is idiotically rare, so this is not something I really recommend anyone to go for. It's going to cost you a ton of money and the benefit is negligible at best. It virtually non-existent. Then if you have the greater ricochet, you need a third offhand, which would be the Caraming switch for your offhand. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, because this third offhand is kind of only really worth it if you end up having an Eldritch Crossbow in an Essence of Finality, because then you can use the EOF to ECB spec rather than the actual ECB weapon, and you'll want to be able to switch freely between these 3 offhands during that spec, because the spec binds to your main hand weapon, and if you keep your main hand on, the spec will remain up. Whereas if you take the main hand off and switch to a 2-handed, the EOF spec will go out, even if it's an Eldritch Crossbow. Other stuff you'd want to care about is these 2 other EOFs. I probably recommend the middle one to be the first one that people go for, because it's just pretty much like universally very powerful. It's also the cheapest option. Range being very expensive right now, I see that recommending upgrades that cost like 2-3 bill each is kind of rough. But first priority EOF should be Darkbow, in my opinion. Second priority should probably be the Seren Godbow. And the third priority should be the Eldritch Crossbow upgrade. The annoying part of upgrading with an Eldritch Crossbow in an EOF is that you still really want to have an Eldritch Crossbow separately, like an actual weapon ECB. So in practice, you need 2 of them. Reasoning for this is because the Darkbow is just overpowered. So that's pretty much all there's to say about that. It's an amazing adrenaline dump. Adrenaline is plentiful with Hydrix and Ascendary bolts. I'll get to those later. And the reason why you want to throw the Seren Godbow into an EOF is because while you're using that spec, wielding a bolt-firing weapon, the effects of the bolts can apply to the Seren Godbow arrows, and normally it cannot, because the Seren Godbow doesn't use ammunition the way it is. So if you, say, use Ruby Criminal bolts with an EOF SGB, then a Ruby proc on that SGB would apply to all 5 arrows, not just one of them. Meaning the max hit potential with a Grimoire and really high damage boost is somewhere, I think it's 75k, it's 5 arrows times 15k, which is completely disgusting. Also, realistically, is probably never going to happen to like almost anyone. But it does, the Ruby procs do happen, they're not that infrequent, and it's actually kind of a huge upgrade to the existing Seren Godbow spec, which is already really good. In terms of ammunition, obviously you want to have your mechanized chins. They're really useful for any kind of group targets. You have PVM applications for this. You also have elite dungeon mobs. Anything where there are more than one target standing within acute vicinity of each other, since the chins hit in a 3x3 area. Then you have your ruby criminal bolts, your hydrix criminal bolts, and in my case, my onyx criminal bolts. And which backs you want to add to this is kind of up to you. There's the dragonstone and diamond variants as well. I tend to ignore those because I don't really care about the effects they have. And in my quiver, I have Ascendry Bolts E. And this one is a little bit weird. Ascendry Bolts are technically tier 94. The level requirement to use them specifies oddly in game, and the damage of the bolts itself is capped by the weapon that you're wielding, meaning that a tier 94 bolt and a tier 99 bolt, as the hydrix criminal bolts, will deal the same amount of damage with a tier 92 weapon. So unless we get weapons that are tier 94 plus, there's never going to be a difference between these, except for currently one idiotic bug. And the special effects of hydrix criminal bolts is that when they proc, they assign an effect to you that increases the adrenaline you gain from the following abilities. They also give an acute adrenaline increase for that ability when they proc. This effect carries over if you switch bolts during. So if the effect is live and you put on your ruby bolts, you'll still get the extra adrenaline per ability afterwards. If you do this with Ascendry bolts, that doesn't work. But if the Ascendry bolts are placed in a quiver, for some reason, you're allowed to swap them freely during, and the effect will still be up. So that's the reasoning why people put Ascendry bolts in a quiver, other than the minuscule prayer bonus of the quivers, and maybe, I don't know, easier overview management of your inventory if you click these or something. But yeah, the difference between these, people ask this a lot, there is none, provided that these are placed in a quiver. The other bolts here are the rubies and the onyxes. The onyxes apply a damage bonus to the hit when they proc. They also heal you for like 500-600. Some situations where food is really scarce, this can be extremely useful. Solak P2, for example, comes to mind. And also if you're just running low on food and you need every bit of healing that you can get. The ruby bolts, I think everyone is familiar with what the ruby bolts does. They proc with a percentage damage addition in proportion to the remaining life points of your target. So the higher the life points of your target, the higher the proc. Obviously this is governed by the same caps as everything else, so it would be 12k or 15k if you're wearing a grimoire. There is currently a bug with Tuska's Wrath ability that's uncapped. So if the Tuska's Wrath ability procs on with a ruby bolt, that will be a 15k even if you're not wearing a grim, which can confuse people. Generally, you'll be wanting to carry at least 2 of these. Bringing a third bolt is kind of niche, or at least very high end. I don't think the third bolt option is something that most people are going to want to worry about. The ones that you do care about are the Ascendrys or the Hydrixes, whichever one you can buy cheaper. They are volatile and weird in price. And then the rubies. And the reason for this is because you want to use your Hydrix or Ascendry bolts with your Greater Ricochet. The Greater Ricochet applies one original hit, then each deflected projectile goes back to the main target, provided there are no minions or other targets nearby. This makes for, I think it's 7 or 8 individual hits, all of which have a separate proc chance for the Ascendry or Hydrix effect, meaning that theoretically one Greater Ricochet can give you somewhere in the neighborhood of like 70 adren, which is just unreal. And that pairs extremely well with having the Dark Bow Essence of Finality, where you dump that adren for extra damage, replacing idiotic basics or just generally bad abilities, because the Dark Bow spec hits vulgarly high. Then you'll have the rubies. These are going to be used primarily for your rapid fires and your Saren Godbows for the proc chance with the Godbow. The reason for the rapid fire is because it's many consecutive hits, and the ruby bolt's proc doesn't work as you'd expect it to with Greater Ricochet. It doesn't apply at 12 or 15k to any of the secondary projectiles. Those get, I think it's halved in damage or something, so it's not as fat as you'd think it'd be, or as you'd hope it'd be. Ruby bolts also have a cooldown. They can't proc like back-to-back, for example. This, I think it's 6 seconds or something that is applied to the target itself. So when you see a ruby bolt proc, you want to throw on your secondary bolt. Juggling these, it's a lot. It takes a while, and realistically, if you're anything like me and prefer convenience over perfection for most of the time, then you're going to be screwing that up and just like camping one type of bolt and not really switching on a per ability basis. This really aids. What I tend to try to do is that in situations where I want adrenaline, I stick to the Hydrix ones, and then I put on my rubies, my rapid fires, and my Cern Godbows. If I have plentiful adrenaline and for some reason don't want to darkbow dump it, then I just throw on the rubies. And then whenever a target drops below like 20% HP or something, it kind of depends on what target and what's useful at the time. It's also, as everything else, they're a little bit situational and dynamic. Then I just switch on to the Hydrix ones and I camp those. And try to use these two special attacks as much as I can as adren dumps. I think that's pretty much it for the gear. Apart from this, you'd also like a planted feet switch. The reason why I haven't listed one here is because it doesn't fucking matter what you put planted feet on. Everyone's arguing about whether or not it should be on a glaive or a defender, so you also have a shield slot in that one weapon, or if it should be on a sun spear to save money. I feel like if you're looking at this chart and this is relevant to you, then saving money probably isn't your primary objective, because you're looking at an idiotic amount of gold spent on upgrades here. But I'd claim that realistically, use planted feet on whatever the hell you want, seriously. It's just a quick switch that you throw on to do one ability and then nothing else with it. So first up is the very, very, very basic range rotation that, in my opinion, no one should really use now that we have the Hydrix tipped bolts, but I'm going to go through this anyway, just because it's the sort of the fundament of where you build from. So the first thing you would do is your Death Swiftness. This is going to be a Death Swiftness Adren pod rotation, and you will want to use your Snapshot and your Rapid Fire once as early as you can. That way you can use them again at the end of that DS, because both of these have a 20-second cooldown and the Death Swiftness is 38 seconds long. So Death Swiftness, pod, then just whichever basics, because it doesn't matter yet. Snap, Rapid, carry on with some basics, then do a Shadow Tendril, carry on with further basics. At this point you could probably throw in like a Bombard or something for good measure, because you're not using any of the perk switches yet. And then as soon as you can, do another Snap and another Rapid Fire. And that will be that. That will be the base of how people used to range before dynamic adrenaline came into the game and adrenaline started becoming the thing that changes how you range and which weapons you use to dump said adrenaline with. And an example of that would be the Dark Bow, because it deals a ton of damage, but it also drains a ton of adren. So if you have more adren than you need for any given situation, then you want to use the D-Bow. Get rid of that. Once you figure that out, it's time to start adding the flanks and the greater ricochets if you have them, and those will have correlating weapon switches, which you can see in my inventory now. So then, instead, it will look something like this. Again, with the Snap and Rapid. Throw in a flank, a Thresh flank. And then finish with the same Snap and Rapid. And at the end of this Rapid, you could get in another Ricochet. So it's still adren bound because I'm still using the Blight Bolts, and this is not going to be applicable to a lot of PVM that you do. This could be applicable if you're only using the Ruby Criminal Bolts, for example, or if you're camping a single style bolt without using the Ascendry or Hydrix switch. Useful tidbits to know for this is the Needle Strike buff, which applies a 7% damage increase to your next ability. You want to use that one before your snapshots, your shadow tendrils, and your either snipes or flanks, depending on if you're using the flank switch for this. Again, not crazy applicable. This is not what you'll want to be doing if you want to use as much of range's power as you can. That comes in with the sentry bolts later on. Another thing that can also come into play is that if you have dual wields and a two-handed weapon, the two-handed weapon in question could be an Eldritch crossbow or theoretically any other two-handed weapon as well. The Eldritch crossbow is kind of the only endgame relevant two-handed, but I guess for lower tiers that would be something like a whatever is it called, the purple one, the Wyvern crossbow, the tier 85. What I'm getting at here is that when you do a dual wield ability, then you put your two-handed on and do the shadow tendrils with that two-handed, you'll get a free auto attack similar to the lossless auto attack that you get when you do like a CGS spec after a dual wield ability. So what that would be is Needle Strike with duals, then put your two-handed, and then shadow tendril, and that hit twice. You also have a similar thing with range as you do with melee, where you can use freedom and get one offhand auto attack and one two-handed auto attack if you switch from your dual wields to your two-handed in the right time during that freedom. Next up will be the Eldritch Crossbow special attack. The ECB spec is 15 seconds long, so you kind of want to budget what abilities you want to squeeze into those 15 seconds to make the most out of it. My personal recommendation is to start and finish with a greater ricochet, provided that you have that ability unlock. Then in the middle of that Eldritch, it depends on if it's done with an actual weapon or if it's done with an Essence of Finality Eldritch spec, because that will determine whether or not you can flank. But the basic one would be something like spec, ricochet, snap, corruption, frag if the target's moving, rapid fire. And then when you see the countdown nearing 1, do another ricochet. Eldritch Crossbow is a little bit weird because it applies the damage bonus in a somewhat unexpected manner, I guess. What ECB spec does is that as long as you're praying Soul Split, it converts any healing that you would have received from Soul Splitting into damage and also quadruples it. I think it's quadruples, so don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure it's 4x. So what happens, which is odd about it, is that there's not a linear percentage of healing received. The higher an ability hits, the lower the percentage of that healing would have been, meaning that some abilities that hit several times but lower hits get bigger percentual increases in Eldritch damage, rapid fire and bleeds being probably the most important among which. What happens with this that can be a little bit confusing is that in a situation where you are alternating between using the ECB spec and not using the ECB spec, you'll probably not want to use your rapid fire unless it's under ECB spec. Whereas outside of the special attack, the time that you spend doing that rapid fire can be better utilized to build more adren with a Sentry or Hydrix bolts to do another dark bow, and that would outweigh the addition. Now for when it gets a little bit weirder, throwing on my Sentry bolts, and I'm going to do a Death Swiftness rotation with the dynamic adren. I'm going to try to fit 1 or 2 dark bows in here. It depends a little bit on how many adren procs I get from all my abilities, but primarily my greater ricochets. So it will be the snap and rapid. My first dark bow after the tendril. My second snap rapid. Another ricochet, and hopefully another debow at the end. That gave me 2 dark bows. Those two dark bows replace two basics. I don't want to go into the percentages of damage increase because honestly no one fucking cares. Just know that the dark bow hits a lot higher. So what the bolts do is they let you dump adrenaline onto debuffs where you would normally use fairly low hitting abilities. That's the foundation of how that works. So what I'm going to be doing now is kind of an extreme variant of this, given that this is a very safe and controlled situation. I'll be using my Grimoire for crit bonus, then a pre-build of Natural Instinct and Incendiary Shot to gain adren from every critical hit, and then dump that adren into Dark Bows. It may sound weird, but you'll see why this is powerful during. I won't be paying much mind to the other abilities during this, because the only thing that's in focus here is the amount of debuffs that you can fit into one single DS if it's done this way. So that would be my Natural Instincts. Building to 100. Incendiary. And DS. Ricochet. First debuff. Second debuff. Third debuff. Another Ricochet. Fourth debuff. Fifth debuff. And sixth debuff. So those 6 dark bows in 38 seconds. Depending on RNG, there can be more freak show instances of this. You can have obviously there was a Relentless proc in the beginning, but you can have better adren gain from your other abilities. You could have adren gain from the dark bows themselves if they crit a lot. And the only real limitation here is how lucky you are with adren gain during, which governs directly how many dark bows you can throw out. But this is a very simple and basic variant of doing really big damage with range over continuous time with a single target if you're able to sacrifice all your adren for DPS and you don't need any kind of defensives or have to run around and wait for stuff or whatever. So what you would do in a rotation like that is that you would alternate your Death Swiftness and your Incendiary Shots. You don't really want to throw the Natural Instinct in there, I don't think so anyway. I've been experimenting with this a little bit to try to figure out a way for people to do Solak really cheap but still perform quite well. And over the span of 5 minutes, the best thing that I've been able to do with this type of rotation, not utilizing the Grimoire, because the Grimoire is banned from my clan's DPS tag rules, was 14-11, and the highest I've been able to do with the Grimoire is 15-16 over a 5 minute span. So translated into DPM, that would be equivalent of about 280k DPM versus 300k DPM, and this is without auras or vulnerability or any other of the damage increasing factors. But it also does require that you have a continuous target that you're able to use this very repetitive and honestly sort of brain dead rotation. What comes into making this rotation better is the way that you plan your needle strikes and your filling abilities during, because obviously you won't be able to debuff every single ability, and how you utilize the spaces in between and which priority order you have is greatly going to determine the damage base of this in a longer continuous manner. So on the next screen, I'll be listing a couple of abilities and the kind of damage base that they have given different situations. That will give you an idea of how to prioritize for when you're not able to use the heavy special attacks. So what I've done here is try to illustrate the way that I'm cycling these abilities to have like some basic guideline of what to aim for. And I really want to stress that this is not going to be the universal solution for every situation. This is something I've been practicing at basically dummy gems and wherever I'm not using the Eldritch special attack a lot. This is a simple sort of overview of how you can cycle these abilities in sort of a trinity to be able to get the max amount of damage out of the dark bow. Throwing ECB specs and Saren Godbows in here does complicate things, and I don't really know how to explain that other than a situation by situation basis, which I don't want to cover in this video. I will go through some alternate Death Swiftness rotations that incorporate the Saren Godbow and the Eldritch Special Attack, but this here is a basic variant of how to separate the abilities and sort of divide them into categories for a rule, if you will, where I've divided everything into heavy damage abilities, filler abilities, needle strike, and then others. Others are not represented in this little illustration of the repetition of the 3 categories. That's because those are more situational than anything else. And what you can see here is the different types of abilities categorized by color, and then the damage multipliers, giving you an idea of how to prioritize them depending on availability. Now, cooldown also plays a part in this. You have your snapshot with your 20-second cooldown, for example. That one should ideally be used twice in a Death Swiftness. You have your Shadow Tendril with your 45-second cooldown. Obviously, that one can only be used once in a Death Swiftness because the DS is 38 seconds and cooldown is 45. Then you have your Dark Bow, the heaviest attack of them all, that uses the most adrenaline, but also does not have a cooldown. So this one is adrenaline reliant rather than anything else. And what I've tried to explain here is fitting the Needle Strike before the heavy attacks, and then using a filler attack for Needle Strike to be available again for the next heavy attack, and then repeating this pattern, sort of. The heavy attack is going to be depending on both how much adrenaline you have available and also which ones you have used already, because the cooldowns play a part in this, and it will not always be this perfect symmetry of just repeating 3, but if you try to aim for something like this and just add more filler abilities in the situation where you need adrenaline to be able to do a heavy attack, then this is going to carry a long way without getting overly complicated. Noteworthy, rapid fire is specified at a higher damage multiplier than some of the other ones here, but it also occupies longer time windows, so this typically replaces 2 of these, which is good to know. And then the Saren Godbow is different depending on the size of the target and the amount of arrows that land, and going through that is an absolute fucking science. It's also very situational, so it's not suitable at every boss, but my personal recommendation would be to ignore the Saren Godbow in any case. The boss is smaller than a 3x3 surface tile area. So what you would get then is this chart of numbers. That would be the 653% max potential basic of 3 arrows, then the 839 max potential of 4 arrows, and the 999% max potential of 5 arrows, and then that multiplied by your Death Swiftness 50% increase. So this bit, I don't really know how to do this or how to explain this because it is really variable, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 back-to-back Death Swiftness rotations, whereas one will be crit whoring the piss out of the Grimoire and my Dark Bow, and the second one is going to be preloaded with an incendiary shot in the midsection between DSs. And then that second one is going to be focusing around throwing the Eldritch Crossbow into the DS and use them both at once. That one will not be focused around Dark Bows. The reason why I separate these 2 is because there is no real way that I could show you one specific rotation, since it's going to be very variable with the dynamic nature of Adren. But I figured if I show you both of these 2 separately, and then some clips with PVM situations where I'm using a combination of both of them, that would clarify at least as much as I'm able to deliver about what I've been trying to explain this whole time. So I'm building up my natural instincts. Throwing the incendiary on. As soon as I get back up to 100, I do my Death Swiftness. Cycling Dark Bows, Tendrils, and Snapshots. trying to finish that with a snap. And then in this midsection, using whichever basics really. As soon as I get up to 100%, I do an incendiary. That one relentless. Doesn't always happen, so for the sake of this, I'm just going to use basics. And then when my death swiftness is up again, going for an Eldritch crossbow spec on the first 2 thresholds. Tendril. When that ECB runs out, which you can see I'm at 100% adren, so I could have dumped further with a Seren Goldbow or something there. Do another ECB for the second set of thresholds. And then just for fun, gonna finish with a debow. That would be one display of how to combine these different things. And one display is, as I've said countless times throughout this video, not gonna apply to every single situation. I'm afraid that's kind of the best I can give you in terms of an overview of how this shit works. That combined with the following 2 clips should be enough to at least give you a basic idea of how the style works. Now to try to finish this off with that, because I keep thinking of new things that I could add to this and it would end up being just a massive information bomb. I'm going to add a couple of PVM clips that illustrate some of the variances in death swiftness rotations. These are situationally adapted to that boss, and I will try to explain why and how they work as a voice track over the relevant clip. So what you'll see here is a slowdown variant of Raksha P1, where I'm using a double Godbow rotation that begins and ends with the Seren Godbow and also utilizes the Eldritch crossbow halfway through for the thresholds. This rotation is adren reliant on some amount of procs to work properly. That's why I'm using the dummy to pre-build up my natural instinct and my incendiary shot to be able to push as much as I can through the beginning of P1 and P2. So make sure to have my Greater Ricochet ready. And a swiftness and a Adren pot. And I Greater Ricochet with my Hydrix bolts to gain Adren. Put on my necklace and my ruby bolts for the Seren Godbow. And then I put my Eldritch necklace on, use that for the snapshot and the rapid fire. Then I put my dark bow necklace on. Use a shadow tendril and a dark bow. Eldritch necklace back on. ECB specking again. And you'll see by the cooldowns now that before my death swiftness runs out, the Seren Godbow is going to be available again for a finisher. So in this ECB I'm doing a second set of thresholds, and then I'm finishing everything off with another Seren Godbow. So that was one variant of trying to connect all these things. Here's another one at Blackstone Dragon, where I'm favoring the Eldritch special attack a little bit more because I'm buffed in damage from Dragon Slayer perk and from Sigils, and my Dragon's Task also from Genocidal. So here I start with ECB specking my first set of thresholds. Then when I'm done with those, I throw in a Seren Godbow. and then I re-Eldritch for a second set of thresholds. Ideally, I could finish this with a dark bow, but I didn't have a Dren to do that. Other than that, obviously there's more to cover here. I have by no means perfected this style yet, because it seems that you just keep learning new stuff the more you try to use it. Try to use some of this knowledge to just design your own little blocks and create some basic strategy for stuff, and then adapt it to whatever you're doing, and maybe, probably most importantly, have fun with it. That's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you for watching all this way through, if you have, and see you next time, yeah?